We're back for Your Ears Only. I'm David Alpern.
And I'm Mark Garber with this quote from the news. This was my first execution, and I was surprised by how peaceful it was. That was Stephanie Grisham, a spokeswoman for Arizona Attorney General Tom Horne, after what other observers called a nearly 2-hour wheezing, gasping, lethal injection death sentence gone wrong. There is growing pressure for Supreme Court review of the process. Now this.
While this ruling is interesting to legal theorists, it has no practical impact on their tax credits right now. You don't need a fancy legal degree to understand that Congress intended for every eligible American to have access to tax credits that would lower their health care costs.
White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest last week brushed aside the notion that millions of Americans enrolled in Obamacare on the federal exchange would lose tax subsidies because of a federal appeals court ruling. It held that such breaks are available only through state exchanges. Not long after, a different federal appeals court issued a contradictory ruling, making it likely the issue eventually will come to the U.S. Supreme Court. But GOP critics of the president didn't wait to cheer the beginning of the end of his health care reform.
They also continued to flay the president for excessive executive action on other aspects of Obamacare and unrelated domestic issues, and excessive passivity when it comes to foreign crises, from Syria to Gaza to Ukraine. To consider the political implications of all these issues and more for Your Ears Only, we're joined again by David Mark, editor-in-chief of the interactive political news and discussion site Politix. He's also the author of Going Dirty, The Art of Negative Campaigning, and co-author of Dog Whistles, Walkbacks, and Washinghandshakes, Decoding the Jargon, Slang, and Bluster of American Political Speech, out next month. Welcome back to the program.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Let's begin with Obamacare. Polls still show it to be widely unpopular, but are there enough folks now enrolled and benefiting to make it difficult for politicians to kill, if not the Supreme Court? Will it be dangerous for Republicans to run against in too many places?
Yeah, I think polling, while it does show the Affordable Care Act to be unpopular, its overall popularity is rising in the polls slowly but surely, particularly when people hear about specific provisions of it, whether it's being able to, young people being able to keep on their parents' health program through age 26, some of the subsidies, some of the other issues. So I don't think you even hear Republicans trying to repeal it as much as maybe going after other specific provisions that aren't working so well. So bottom line, people are getting more used to it and liking it more.
The controversy over Central American kids crossing our southern border illegally also has political implications, with Republican Texas Governor Perry mobilizing the National Guard, though the refugees actually come to surrender. Does his handling of the issue help rehabilitate his presidential prospect?
It has the potential to. It certainly shows Governor Perry to be more in charge, like he's taking executive action. Of course, he has quite limited powers here. He can't really deal with immigration issues, which is the crux of the matter, whether or not they're deported, whether the Immigration Naturalization Service allows them to stay or go or has deportation hearings. But it certainly shows Governor Perry to have taken charge of an issue and not kind of be wishy-washy and forgetful the way he came off in the 2012 Republican presidential primaries.
Well, some analysts still expect some movement in Congress on immigration, though likely less on reform than redoubling enforcement, maybe trying to rewrite the law President Bush signed to provide refugee proceedings for Central Americans escaping violence. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I think there's going to be forced action. As you suggest, it's not likely to be the grand, sweeping immigration-type law along the lines of what President Reagan signed into law in 1986 and what had been discussed for several years now. But members of Congress on both sides of the aisle have compelling reasons to deal with this border crisis. President Obama has asked for nearly $4 billion in aid to try and secure the border and deal with deportations. Republicans in Congress want less, but I think there'll be some kind of agreement, if only to end the urgency of the current crisis.
Despite the drama on borders here in Gaza and Ukraine, Obama has kept up a steady schedule of fundraiser. Does the president lose stature by doing that, or is he helping to fill Democratic coffers the best way he can, given the fact that his own approval rating is so sinking?
Right. That's certainly the argument that the Democrats make, even if they don't talk about his unpopularity. They suggest that he can do his job just fine remotely, like President George W. Bush did from his ranch in Crawford, Texas, for a considerable amount of time. And they also argue that a lot of the criticism is really aimed at preventing President Obama from doing his job as president. And the White House is pushing back pretty hard on this, saying, you know what, there's satellite communications equipment available. There's no reason that President Obama is not fully engaged when he's on the road.
Going back to the Republican side, Paul Ryan has made an interesting proposal for reforming federal social spending. Rand Paul is making a more direct approach to African-American voters. Talk about that.
Right. They both are taking kind of unorthodox routes, you might say, for Republicans in Congress. Congressman Ryan's proposal is the more controversial of the two among African-American voters. He's talking about basically reforming a spate of welfare programs to make them block grants, allow states to oversee them. This has some support among governors, but a lot of people say if you start doing that, then the federal government will eventually reduce its overall spending and it will do more harm than good. Obviously a very debatable notion. Rand Paul is making a more explicit outreach approach to African-American voters. He's talking about reining in some of the rules in southern states to restrict voting rights, to tighten voting rules, also to allow felons to vote, former felons, which is a pretty controversial notion.
A newly released NBC Marist poll illustrates the Democratic Party's gender gap. It's with women voters. In the U.S. Senate race in Colorado, incumbent Democrat Mark Udall is up by 12 points among female voters, 50% to 38%, as Democratic groups like Senate Majority PAC are running TV ads focusing on abortion and contraception. How important do you see the gender gap to be in this year's midterms and in 2016?
I think it's absolutely huge, and that's one of the reasons Democrats are focusing so intently on issues like contraception coverage, abortion, these kind of wedge social issues, because particularly single women are a deal-breaker constituency in this election. You could argue that President Obama secured re-election through the help of single women in states like Colorado, Virginia, Florida, and elsewhere. And we're seeing continued focus on that, and I think we're going to hear it amped up even more in the coming months up to Election Day.
David Mark is editor-in-chief of the interactive political news and discussion site Politix. He's also the author of Going Dirty, The Art of Negative Campaigning, and co-author of Dog Whistles, Walkbacks, and Washinghandshakes, Decoding the Jargon, Slang, and Bluster of American Political Speech, out next month.
Quote from the news, "I'm very happy I was doing it when I was doing it. I'm very happy now I'm not doing it." That was a comment on Congress by former Democratic House member Barney Frank back on Capitol Hill briefly to testify on finance reform.
Next, Philip Seymour Hoffman's fine film farewell, for your ears only.